it's a very interesting set of issues which you've raised at this forum today and tomorrow. If we could have the next slide up, please. I must just quickly say that I've enjoyed the two presentations so far, but the first speaker, Professor Bester, I listened very carefully to any reference to a hugely important contributor to good health. And I didn't hear him. Sorry, maybe I missed it, but it's a huge important contributor to bad health if you haven't got it. I refer to safe and functioning water and sanitation infrastructure, which is arguably the #1 disease prevention measure of all time. And I don't think you mentioned that at all. Now, just in my opinion, I think that's a considerable omission, if you don't mind me saying so. Okay, next slide, please. Who knows what the future may bring, but arguably a bigger disaster ongoing for many years than those listed here, which you are going to deal with, pandemics, public health, and all those kind of things, which is increasing in intensity and affecting every one of us on a daily basis, whether we're sick or not, is a widespread failure of our public sector infrastructure, and failure that is to deliver the service for which that infrastructure was intended. Next slide, please. For example, we have been regaled this year by a lot of pictures of the floods in KZN in April this year. And we see this kind of thing happening, which is because of natural disasters, yes, but hugely exacerbated by failures of the infrastructure. Next slide, please. This is mudslide, for example. And by the way, please let us not forget, next slide, please, that this April 2022 event was not the worst storm intensity that we've seen in this country. Going back many years, the Umfolozi floods, which I think was 1987, 35 years ago. So they were actually higher intensity, I'm told, than those of this year. So we have these big natural disasters, hugely exacerbated, next slide please, by the neglect of infrastructure, the effect of infrastructure. Let me illustrate. Next slide, please. Some years ago, I was on a Water Research Commission reference group. The project leader, the team leader was CSIR. They've been asked to put together a list of criteria and like 10 top things which a municipality ought to do to cope with climate change. I'm sitting at the meeting and they're presenting these 10. And afterwards I said, do you know that 8 of those are actually basic infrastructure maintenance? It's the kind of stuff we should be doing anyway. And for example, these photographs from KZ in this year, this kind of thing, why was so much flood damage? Well, bad planning for the one thing, and not enforcement of regulations, but also that the infrastructure had been built maybe to cope with flooding situations such as we had, but it was not maintained. So it really got blocked. Now, maintained in the sense of the catchment, a lot of stuff lying around in the catchment just waiting to be washed downstream, alien vegetation and so on quickly uprooted, waiting to be washed downstream, and then the culverts themselves not kept clean as they ought to be. Next slide, please. And here's a really, really good example, if you prefer a bad example, of a culvert which is totally jammed up. And the result, where do you think the water went? Well, the water just went around and over the top. Next slide, please. In that picture you've just seen there now, a lot of what's blocking that culvert is trash. Now, how did the trash get there? Well, it's situations like this, for example. And if people think I've been knocking eThekwini for the last few slides, next slide, please. This is over the weekend, the local Boksburg knock and drop had a couple of photographs of Boksburg Lake. And this kind of stuff is in the lake. Now, guess where that goes? That goes into the stormwater system. And then the next big rainfall event, we find that the stormwater system is readily blocked. This is the kind of stuff I mean by a lack of infrastructure maintenance. A very simple example. Next slide, please. And by the way, this particular Boksburg Lake is right next to the municipal offices, and yet nothing clearly is a major accumulation been taking place there. Next slide, please. So when that water is blocked from where it's supposed to go through, you look down the bottom end, the water is supposed to go through here. There's a sort of a white morass. Apologies for the quality of the photograph, but the morass down right at the bottom, middle of the photograph, is where is a pile of stuff blocking the culvert. So the water finds its own way. And right towards the top of the photograph, you see it's breached its banks and then into the road and across and destroyed those buildings. And that is all man-made. I'm sorry. The climate change brought floods, yes, but the design of the stormwater was such that it ought to have been able to pass those floods. But because we didn't maintain it, it flooded and caused damage. It's a very, very simple example. Another example which you've got on your list, Madam Chair, is, next slide, please, of water, the opposite problem of water. There is no water. And here is Mpofu Dam. I'm not that familiar with the Nelson Mandela Bay area, but I believe it is one of the contributors to the water situation in Nelson Mandela Bay. It's in the state in June this year. Next slide, please. Here's the intake tower, which you can see it's so low they can't even draw water. That was June this year from it because it's so low. It's right down the junky stuff in the bottom of the dam. And okay, we can discuss at length how that happened, but the net result is that the infrastructure was not built, it was not maintained, because the same city has got an immense leakage problem. I don't know the exact figure, I wasn't able to check on it, but last time I looked, it was over 40% of the water supplied to that city was leaking away. That's water which has been caught in dams, pumped, treated, distributed. 40% of that water was leaking away. Now you can imagine if that water had not been leaking away, it wouldn't really matter if Mpofu Dam was empty. In fact, Mpofu Dam wouldn't be empty because that water would be available. And that again is infrastructure which is simply not maintained. Next slide, please. This is a second last example of disasters which are really are man-made. I think we all know the history of Eskom and why it's in the state that it is. It really was a large story of not building infrastructure which should have been built at the time and not maintaining the infrastructure when it ought to have been maintained. And on the left-hand side is 100% of power availability from the Eskom generation capacity. Okay, hopefully they never ever need to use no power station if it needs to put out 100%, because then it's definitely overstressed. But it started off, say, at about 85%, and then there was that peak towards the right-hand side where the national government imperative was to keep the lights on. Okay, so you keep your car running, you don't maintain it, you don't look after it properly. After a year or so, you know what happens to your car? It starts to break down. And that's exactly what's been happening. We're now down below 65% in end of 2021. The oh, is this my biography on the right-hand side? Oh, okay. The other end of the scale, next slide, please. Last Thursday, the lights went off in our part of Pretoria, and it turned out to be that the local substation had, it says here, dramatically blew up. It didn't blow up, it caught fire, but we had a blanket blackout for several hours. Now, this infrastructure, this substation, it's over 60 years old, that equipment. It's long past its sell-by date and been under-maintained for a large part of that time. Next slide, please. Here we have from the rail safety regulator the number of incidents. Now the blue line is incidents related to wear and tear and that kind of stuff. But here's another menacing issue which is threatening the infrastructure of this country, and it is vandalism and theft. That red line is, and you can see it's from 2010 through to 2021. This is the number of what they call security-related incidents per million train kilometers. And you can see this steep increase in these so-called security-related incidents. It's threatening our infrastructure. Next slide, please. Threatening it to the extent that we see on that next slide, that slide, yeah, that we see this kind of stuff on the news periodically. All right, pretty dire picture, but I just do want to underline, maybe I've overemphasized it, to underline that the infrastructure has to be looked after. And the fact that it's not being looked after properly in this country is a national disaster of epic proportions. Next slide, please. And this is mostly man-made, was and is preventable. And that's the sad part about it. You know, it's not like something we cannot control, like the climate. It is something that we could and should have been doing more about. Next slide, please. Failure, broadly terms, why? Maybe wrong technology in the first place, maybe substandard construction is not big enough, maybe it wasn't big enough at the start, or it's just not big enough anymore, maybe it's obsolescent before its time, maybe it's badly operated. I mean, you can take two cars, you can give one to a very good driver and one to a very bad driver, and at the end of 3 or 4 years, just see which of those cars is still working fine and which car is not. And then in poor condition and it's aging before its time, and the reason for that, generally speaking, is not being maintained properly and or not operated properly. Next slide, please. One of the reasons why so much infrastructure in this country is not maintained, not operated properly, not looked after properly, is this lack of technical skills, civil, mechanical, electrical, chemical engineering skills. It's not, the skills are not there, and there's a whole host of reasons, and I can talk all day about why. But the fact is that we don't have the people to look after them. This is a little bit old, it's 2016, but it's a map showing which municipalities simply don't have any civil engineering professional and practitioner. And that doesn't mean to say they haven't got an engineer. It means they haven't got an engineer or a technologist or a technician. So they've got tens of millions of rands worth of infrastructure paid for grudgingly by the taxpayers in the ground, and they have no one to look after it. Now, how crazy is that? But this is a sad, sad, sad situation. Blue ones and the green ones, they're the relatively goody ones, and the dark red, they're the ones where they just have got nobody at all. And there's a whole lot of reasons sitting behind that. And I don't want to go into that as well, but I just published a paper on it recently. So next slide, please. Then we go into my two propositions to say that some kinds of disasters, without question, would have been less calamitous if the infrastructure were better managed and maintained. So, for example, your climate change thing, I've been pointing that out, and your flooding. But aside of disasters such as those discussed at this conference, that infrastructure is not better managed and maintained is a disaster in itself. A disaster we cannot blame on anything else, not climate change, not the economy or anything like that, not anything except ourselves. Next slide, please. I put two statements up there. Okay, well, the editorial business has been very quiet on this issue for a long time. Business is starting to point out that the effects of this on the economy are absolutely staggering. It's so many examples I could have quoted of that, but for example, Business Minerals Council came out recently and saying about Transnet, and they've spoken of annualized losses of 50 billion rand in 2022, reflecting lost export tonnage of iron ore, coal, chrome, and manganese because of the state of the Transnet rail lines. 50 billion rand we could have had in this coming to this country, and it's up 43% from 2021. So in other words, in 2021 it was pretty bad as well. African Rail Industry Association has pointed out that Transnet is underspent on maintenance over the last decade to the tune of 27 billion rand. They just have not spent the money, and the result is that the infrastructure is not in a good state. Next slide, please. If we are to fix this infrastructure, I'm going to talk about municipalities. I could talk about all the public sector people, but let's just talk about municipalities as a proxy for all public sector infrastructure. And if we've got to fix the infrastructure, we need to know things like this. What is the condition? How does infrastructure get itself into this condition? Are there maintenance and repair guidelines, which indication is what people should be spending, but what are they actually spending? Okay, and then, okay, so now, so what? Next slide, please. I've put up two statements there, and they're pretty contentious statements. And before people start, I don't know how you do this online, throw eggs or rotten tomatoes at people, but before anybody starts throwing those kinds of things at me, I just need to mention that I didn't actually say these things, but maybe you'd be impressed by who actually did say them. Next slide, please. And they're credible people. The guy who said it was time to stop building and start fixing is a gift of the giver's founder. Forget the basic income grants, rather fix the municipalities, the former finance minister. So I'm not the only person who's saying this. Next slide, please. So let's go and say, what is the condition of South Africa's municipal infrastructure? Next slide, please. I've chosen 3 indicators to show. The one is the green drop certification, which the Department of Water Sanitation has at long last brought out after several years gap. And the 965 wastewater systems in the country, but only 22 green drops were awarded, which is down from 2013, the last time, which is where 60 were awarded. And I do need to point out that these green drop is not excellence, although it's often touted to be. It's actually doing what you should be doing. It's what you should be doing, not excellence by any means. And you can see the areas where it's been worst, and those who are scoring particularly well. Generally, it's the metros that are doing best. And then other areas, the red is where it is really far off critical in many cases, the wastewater. And you can imagine what happens if your wastewater is not treated properly, where that ends up. It ends up in the rivers and streams, and sometimes communities downstream have to use those water resources, or it ends up in the water which is pumped out for irrigation purposes into our food. That's a disaster. Nobody can say it's not. Next slide, please. The next indicator is the South African Institute of Civil Engineering Infrastructure Condition Report Cards, which have come out periodically, 2006. And next, 2011, next, 2017. And then the next one came out in November on the 11th, November 11th, last month, in other words. And quickly to the next slide, please. Just to say, this is the scoring which they use. We got this from the Americans, by the way. I've been research manager for all 4 of these things. A, world class, through to E, unfit for purpose. And where do we sit as far as South Africa is concerned? Well, overall average. And average, of course, is a bit of a nebulous concept. My one hand can be in the fridge, other hand in the stove. On average, my temperature is absolutely fine. But the average across all infrastructure sorts in 2006 was D+. So in other words, yes, at risk of failure, but looking a bit positive. Then because of all the stuff that was built for the World Cup, the car train and the freeways and the stadiums and so on, it was lifted in 2011 up to C-. And then 2017, it went back to D+. And this year, it's deemed D, which is the lowest it's ever been. So it's really, really, really at risk of failure. That is the assessment by the engineers who actually work with this stuff all the time. Next slide, please. A third indicator is the Auditor General's reports, which are absolutely fantastic in all the stuff that they talk about. So she says the first paragraph there, she says that the fact that the infrastructure is in the state that it is an indictment on the entire local government accountability ecosystem, which failed to act and arrest the decline. Because don't forget, the infrastructure in the bad condition means, no, go back, please. Infrastructure in the bad condition is impacting directly on service delivery. And then this conference is about social justice, but as the Attorney General points out in the next paragraph, she says especially delivery of services for the poor. Most jarring revelations concern the impact of service delivery upon the most vulnerable of our citizens, the poor. SAICE absolutely agrees with her. We've been talking about the failure of the basic services for the poor. Next slide, please.
Prof Wall?
Yes, ma'am.
You've got about 5 minutes.
Only 5. Okay.
Yes, sorry.
Well, that's fine.
Because our program is slightly behind, so I want to leave more time for questions, and certainly there will be time for questions for you.
Good. Okay, fine. Well, let's just zip through this. I've got a number of examples here. Let's just zip through them quickly. Next slide, please. Lovely beach. Next slide. But if people can't use it, despite the mayor's much publicized swim over the weekend. Next slide, please. But one must not forget, next slide, please, that this didn't come because of the floods. This is dated last year. And Ekurhuleni has had a series of problems with its systems. Next slide, please. This is now something which generates R1 billion per annum for the city of Johannesburg. And it seems it's not being looked after, which I think is a bit silly because it could come to your exchequer. Next slide, please. And then this slide is to point out that when one service fails, in this case Eskom, it can affect other services as well, in this case the passenger rail agency. Next slide. How did municipalities get themselves into this condition? Next slide, please. Well, reluctant political will, complex regulations, time-consuming procedures, weak or overburdened skills, and in many cases, and Eskom's a case in point, the simple infrastructure, simply maintenance, it's just the patient is terminal. Maintenance is no longer the answer. It actually needs to be replaced. And then lack of funding. So next slide, please. This is something which was calculated in the green drop. How much money would this cost? Well, they said to restore all the current wastewater treatment works to the original design, over 8 billion rand, and then amount to maintain them. And that's just for the treatment works, not for everything else, and it's not for the water. But the DWS annual budget on its main account is only 20 million. And of course, that's got to go to other stuff as well. And what about all the roads and electricity and all those other things? We just don't have the money to maintain this infrastructure, it would seem, especially considering the state to which some of it's been reduced. Next slide, please. And the Auditor General says, but the municipalities haven't got the money. They're simply in dire straits. And how does that come about? It was a whole long story. And I've actually just written a paper about the local government white paper of 1998, where this whole thing was designed. And municipalities, I'm sorry, in many cases, it seems they were set up to fail. They just couldn't possibly have succeeded. Next slide, please. Are there guidelines? Yes. Next slide, please. The Treasury has got a circular, next slide, please, which talks about the financial ratios, which should be, and in the gist of it is that, next slide, please, that they should be spending 8% of their book value, next slide, on maintenance and repair. Although good practice says you should actually be spending more and measuring it differently. But let's go with the 8% because most municipalities don't know the condition of their assets. Next slide, please. And there we are. So that's how it spells it out there. But what are they actually spending? Next slide, please. Norm is 8%, it says, but in fact, it's Treasury talks about it in terms of the intention is a minimum. In fact, next slide, please. And what are, carry on, next slide, please. What are municipalities spending? Next slide, please. This is what they budgeted back some years ago for 2019-20. The figures, the latest figures Treasury has got across the municipalities of what they've actually spent is, next slide, please, for that particular year. And you can see what they actually did spend. And it's way short, way short. In two cases, the figures are from previous years, which Treasury doesn't seem to have the latest figure. Next slide, please. That's the metros. And if you look at some municipalities, a random sample of them, you'll see that there's only one which is anywhere near that 8% norm, which, as I've said, is in any case inadequate. So they're just not spending the money to keep things going. Next slide, please. And even when a municipality is spending the right amount of money, as the City Engineering Department pointed out, because of the amount of infrastructure that they have, so simply the roads, that they cannot keep it in the good nick that it is with the budget that they've got for the MTF. And the amount of very poor is going to increase and the amount of very good is going to decrease. Next slide, please. So now what? Next slide, please. Well, they don't have the money, but to be spending as little as many of them do is folly. And the fact remains that they've got a responsibility for all of this infrastructure, the purpose of which is to deliver services. And if they're not, infrastructure is not in good nick, they're not delivering services. So we have a quandary. But they keep acquiring more infrastructure to look after, and one can't argue the fact that more people need more infrastructure. And other public sectors, much the same story, with the exceptions of Sanlaw and the Airports Company. The Airports Company, of course, if they allow their runways and air traffic control systems to fall apart, then they would simply be not allowed to land aircraft and negating the entire purpose in life. Next slide, please, which I think is the last one. If that's not a huge disaster with enormous impact on all in this country, especially the poor, then I don't know what the term disaster means. That's my last slide. Madam Chair, you did ask us to come up with ideas. I do have a number, but they were added in pen, scribbling away here while the other speakers were presenting. And I think we have really run out of time. Thank you.